Welcome, everyone, to the 5th edition of the Sephardi Modernities seminar series. When we first launched this series, we could have never imagined it would get to hold onto this space for 5 years already. Thank you all for your continued support and interest, and more specifically, thank you to our sponsors. Our seminar is co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Calgary Institute for the Humanities at University of Calgary, with the support of the Belzberg Program for Israel Studies. The title of this year's series is Partners, Outsiders, and Others, Sephardi Jews and the Global Left, and it is organized by Yuval Ivri and myself, Angie Cohen. This seminar is an academic space of reflection on experiences of Jewish modernization beyond the European model. We started by bringing speakers to work on a definition of modernity tuned to Sephardi experiences, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. We then moved on to studying the relations between the old and the new in Sephardi cultures and histories. We discussed questions of epistemic authority, relations between Jews and their surrounding cultures, and how politics has impacted the way we look at Jewish history. We then focused on the uses of the past in research agendas, or in other words, the political and moral consequences of our research. Last year, we learned from Mizrahi feminist research and activism as a different paradigm for coexistence, peace, security, and a shared future. These issues emerge against the backdrop of Jewish modernization processes that take place in dialogue with Arab and Muslim cultures and locations. These are the contexts of the specifically Sephardi experiences of otherness that we have studied. This year, as the worlds we inhabit continue to become increasingly divided and violent, we double down on our commitment to holding space for conflicting narratives and ambivalence, to include all voices, those which sit comfortably with our ideas and values, and those who might challenge them. It is our task, as receivers of the history and experiences of Sephardic Jews, to hold on to the tension and conflict between those different narratives and not attempt to solve it.
This lecture series explores the complex relationship between Sephardi Jews and the global left, focusing on their role in shaping political movement, intellectual thought, and social activism across diverse geographies and historical contexts. Spanning from the late 19th century through the 20th century, the series traces the involvement of Sephardi Jews in socialist, communist, and anti-colonial movements, as well as in their place in post-colonial thought. During the series, the guest speakers will examine how their diasporic identities, experiences of marginalization, and encounters with European colonialism influenced their political engagements. Through a multidisciplinary lens, the series will delve into key regions, including the Middle East, North Africa, Southern Europe, and Latin America, where Sephardi communities played a significant role in advancing progressive causes. Particular attention we will give into how these communities navigated the intersection of class, race, ethnicity, and nationality, and how Sephardi Jews' experiences as minorities in both Jewish and non-Jewish contexts inform their political commitments. Topic covered will include Sephardi Jews' contribution to socialist and communist and also labor movements, anti-fascist and anti-imperialist struggles, and the promotion of equality and justice in both Jewish and broader societal context. The series will also engage with the tension that arose within Sephardi communities regarding Zionism and the broader Jewish left, highlighting the internal debate and diverse political trajectories. By exploring the often overlooked history of Sephardi Jews within a global left movements, the lecture series aimed to offer a new insights into the multifaceted role of Jewish identity in shaping modern political history and the enduring legacy of Sephardi political activism in global progressive movements. So now, without further ado, we will introduce our great speakers today. The first speaker is Moshe Behar, which holds a PhD in comparative politics from Columbia University and is a senior lecturer in Arabic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Manchester. Dr. Behar's teaching and research focuses on Palestine-Israel question, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli society and politics, Middle Eastern and Mizrahi Jews, and intertwined development of Jewish and Arab nationalisms. His work includes the wonderful anthology that is very connected to the series this year, Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writing on Identity, Politics, and Culture from 1893 to 1958. It was published by our own Brandeis Press in 2013. I really recommend this anthology to everyone who teach on Middle East and Jewish studies. He is also a co-founder of the Mizrahi Civic Collective and a member of Academia for Equality, Academia L'Shivyon, and Academics for Peace. Our second speaker, Gabriel Abensour, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Jewish History at the Hebrew University. He recently submitted his dissertation, congratulations, Gabriel, explores the cultural history of Algerian Jews during the colonial period. Gabriel is also a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where he co-leads a research seminar on intellectual heritage of North African Jews.
Before we start, we kindly remind you all that the seminar will be structured as usual, 45 to 50 minutes of presentation and half an hour of Q&A. Roy Shukron will be moderating the chat, so you're all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure you let us know on the chat and wait for your turn. So, Moshe, it's your turn.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope that I'm heard okay. Great. So first of all, I mean, there are a lot of titles related to this event. One is the overall title of the whole series, which I'm not going to address. And I just wanted to say that both Gabriel and I are addressing our own little topic. And in the case of mine, the title is Leftist Arabized Jews, Arab Nationalism, and the Question of Individual and Collective Rights. When I provided this title, I, for some reason, thought that I have 45 minutes to speak. And then the brutal organizers told me, no way, you have 20 minutes. So this is the first lesson for the possible undergraduates here to take care of titles. My title, don't title your papers in the same way I did today. Right, so let's move on. I want to start with two terminological notes, and everything is going to be very brief and quick today and crisp, I hope. So the phrase is leftist Arab Jews, leftist Arabized Jews. So the first thing I want to say is that we are speaking about a colonial context. Even individuals in the chat here who do not subscribe to the view that Zionism is a form of colonialism, that's a legitimate position. Nobody would deny the fact that Zionism may be viewed as a little surfer in San Francisco or Los Angeles surfing on the colonial wave. So it's even if he himself is not the wave, right? But that's an issue here. In the context of colonialism, the use of the word left is not exactly like the use of the left, of the label or the signifier left in ordinary discussions, because in the talk that I'm giving now, when I say left, I essentially mean a person that thoroughly takes into account the position of the indigenous Asian or African individual whom he or she encounter. So you can, for example, be like Zev Jabotinsky, a liberal, but you are not left because your view of the Palestinian Arabs is quite hostile, or you can be a liberal or a capitalist that wishes to incorporate or to grant full equality to the colonized subject. Then in my discussion, this is the criteria for left. And I even was careful to say leftist. I didn't even say left. Leftist Arabized Jews. The second issue is that the word Sephardic dominates the seminar here. I chose to use Arabized Jews. I did not choose to use Arab Jews. And unfortunately, I have no time to explain it. I will maybe insert 2 links in the chat to make the argument or the case why I think that the signifier Arabized Jews is the best one to denote collectively the nearly 800,000 Jews that lived across the Middle East before 1948, remind you, in 9 Arab states. So it's quite a complex structure, and to use a single label to describe all of them, given their diversity, I think Arabized Jews is the best one, but the argument is not there. So what I'm doing here, very brief few propositions and observation on 3 historical moments or episodes that are independent of each other. The first one is few words about Palestinian Jews after the publication of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This is number 1. Number 2 is some notes about Marxist anti-Zionist Jews in Iraq in the mid-1940s, also episode 2, so from 1917 to the mid-1940s, and final episode that relates to Arabic-speaking Jews, Arabic-speaking communist Jews inside the state of Israel in the early 1950s. And let me just start with the first episode, so to speak. Yuval knows a lot about this chapter. He published an article both in English and Hebrew about it. I'm going to refine a few points there. So when the Balfour Declaration was published, let me just summarize what the Balfour Declaration says. It's 67 words, and in one way to read the Balfour Declaration is to say that the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917 awards both individual and collective rights to Jews and awards only individual rights to Palestinian Arabs. So the issue here is that unfortunately for the Palestinian Arabs, I suspect, right, in 1917, Britain does not recognize the Palestinian Arabs as a distinct collectivity. It views them chiefly as Arabs, not as Palestinians. And because of that, the assumption of the British administrators and the British colonialists is that Palestinians can realize their individual rights inside Palestine, but if they wish to exercise or realize their collective rights, they can do it in any place in the Arab Middle East outside Palestine, because outside Palestine, the Arab collective right is realized. So that's the issue. Now, let me just say one other thing. Unfortunately for the Palestinian Arabs, during the time, of course, the Zionists also did not view Palestinians as a collection of individuals that comprise collective group, right? That's why they did not entertain awarding them collective rights. But it was not only the British and the Zionists that did not view the Palestinians as a collective, a distinct collectivity, because also the Hashemites from Arabia, those that collaborated with the British Empire during the First World War, those Sharif Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashemi that concluded the agreement with Sir Henry McMahon, he also thought that the Palestinians are chiefly Arabs, and also was of the view that Palestine should be part of the Arab state that comes instead of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the context there. And here come in this context Palestinian Jews, and Palestinian Jews, and one of them, Yosef Kastel, writes a document that is 17-page long. Actually, should say 17-page single-spaced. So in a way, it's probably 8,000 words. So it's not a small document. And essentially what he says with some other people around, this is around 1920, few years after the publication of this report, and many people here in the audience are academics, so they're going to understand my language. He basically says to Lord Balfour, okay, thank you for the text, and he hands the text back and says, revise and resubmit. Okay, what does it mean, revise and resubmit? He says to Balfour, you need to take the text, revise the Balfour Declaration, and award in the new declaration both individual and collective rights to both Jews in Palestine and Palestinian Arabs. This is quite a remarkable step in the context of the time. Not right now, it seems trivial, but in the context of the time, it's really very interesting because, first of all, he, like many other Palestinian Jews, does recognize the fact that the Palestinian Arab comprise a distinct collectivity, right? Even if they are Arabs, they still are Palestinians and they should be viewed as unique. And the second thing that he suggests is that in the revised Balfour Declaration, what is going to happen, that Palestine, because that's what the place is called at the time, I don't want to say Eretz Israel because it's a bit odd, Palestine should be the shared homeland of Arabs and Jews. And shared homeland, Moledet Meshutefet, is the chief concept that dominates the 8,000 words document. And here's my addition to Yuval and Hillel that wrote about it quite a lot. Hillel, our friend, comrade Hillel Cohen, was the person that actually located the text of Castell. So the thing is that the main issue with the argument of Castell and some people like him, Palestinian Jews, was that the shared homeland should not be just shared homeland of a collection of Jewish, non-Jewish individuals. It was supposed to be a shared homeland also of collectivities. So this element of awarding collective rights to both groups was the main issue there. This view was opposed, everybody knows that this view was opposed by the Zionist movement because the Zionist movement essentially did not want a shared homeland, it wanted a Jewish state. And if you are going to create a Jewish state, the non-Jews are not equal participants in this enterprise. So the Zionists are against him. But one thing that people tend to forget that during the time that he writes, also the majority of the members of the Palestinian national movement are also do not subscribe to his view, because especially back then, and by the way, it can be also justified, the Palestinian Arabs do not think that Jews in Palestine should be awarded collective rights. Because the issue here that at the moment that we discuss, the members of the Zionist movement and members of the Palestinian national movement do not view each other as collectivities. And this is exactly the opposite of some Palestinian Jews. And in this sense, by the way, I'm not aware of anyone who, as early as 1919, 1920, fully conceptualized the situation as a situation that comprises two distinct groups. The other thing that needs to be said is that in some respects, my reading of Castell is that even if he said that he's a Zionist, he is not a Zionist, because the moment that he opposes the notion of a Jewish state, an exclusive, separatist Jewish state, and speaks about a shared state, that's it. The story of Zionism ends there, according to my reading of the issues. Right, so here we have someone who thinks about individual and collective rights in the context of Jewish nationalism and Palestinian nationalism. Even if his view back then was maybe, not anachronistic, or maybe did not fit the time, ultimately history, I think, proves the fact that his reasoning was quite sound, even if he was a pioneer in the sense in seeing things. So I think that he may have been, and sorry about the colloquial language, may have been a weirdo during his time, but if you think about him in contemporary terms, he is a very smart guy. And that's one thing. Now, right, let me just I'm going to move now, not to the mid-1940s in Iraq, but I'm going to the chapter of the early 1950s in Israel. Here I'm addressing or I'm discussing Jews who are Arabic speaking, Arab Jews if you want, Arabized Jews, doesn't matter, mostly Jews from Iraq and Egypt that were also communists in terms of their belief, right? By the 1950s, among most communists on earth, right, maybe outside the Middle East, the view is that a Hebrew-speaking collectivity does exist and was socially constructed into the Middle East since the beginning of Zionism in the 1880s until the 1950s, in a period of 70 years, even if this collectivity did not exist in the past, the political, economical, cultural, and lingual processes did produce a collectivity there. So communist Arabic-speaking communist Jews in the 1950s in Israel do believe that Israeli Jews, not Jews in general, Israeli Jews do deserve individual and collective rights, and Palestinian Arabs, or especially those that managed to escape the Nakba or the Palestinian catastrophe, the people that stayed in Israel also deserve individual and collective rights. So their view, right, is not that a de-Zionist state that is going to just award equal individual rights to everybody that lives in the territory can deliver the remedy to the question of Palestine at stake. And interestingly enough, these individuals are writing in Al Jadid, which is the chief or the most important Palestinian publication. It's interesting that the Palestinian communists at the time also tolerate this position. Some of them don't, but many of them are. It relates to the fact that that Marxists or communists in the world experienced some kind of a transformation during the previous 30 years. And let's say that by the time the Jews comprise roughly 29% of the population in Palestine, roughly 1939, let alone 33% of the population, the view of many Marxists who read Joseph Stalin and Lenin writings about the national question, 1913 and 1915, basically that the Hebrew-speaking collectivity fulfills the condition of what a nation is or what a collectivity is, and that's why the change of position. The debate between the Jews back then is whether they, as Arabic speaker or native speakers of Arabic, supposed to know, and also Marxists, supposed to use Hebrew or Arabic when they deliver their art, poetry, and prose. And interestingly enough, many of them said, despite the fact that our Hebrew is not as good as our Arabic, our role is to publish in Hebrew because there exists out there a Hebrew-speaking collectivity that needs to be recruited into the communist ranks, especially the Hebrew-speaking working class. And this working class or these Hebrew-speaking individuals need to be brought into the view that both Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews deserve equally full individual rights and collective rights, either in two separate states or in a single state that is going to be a federation or a confederation, a state that grants or awards equal rights to both groups. Right. Now, how much time do I have, if I may ask?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so as far as the third chapter, so by the way, everything that I said corresponds with the question of what Arab nationalism is, right? Arab nationalism, what is the view that should be adopted by Palestinian nationalists and Arab nationalists in relation to the minority Jewish community that exists on the ground. So you get here two answers from the around the Balfour Declaration in the 1950s that says, yes, we, from our leftist Arabized Jewish perspective, we see two collectivities, and members of this collectivity need to be awarded equal individual rights and collective rights. For example, one person, one vote is not going to deliver a remedy that is needed. So, for example, John Stuart Mill or John Locke, right, or liberalism in general is insufficient to address the problem at stake. It is a necessary condition, but insufficient one, because liberalism does not see collectivities. For Marxists, it's easier to see collectivity because Marxism is about collective rights, of course, of the working class. Let me conclude now by discussing anti-Zionist Marxist Jews in Baghdad in the 1940s. Here, there's no question about the fact that they belong to the left, and usually they are very much discussed because of their anti-Zionism, because they are the most radical anti-Zionists out there. But mostly people don't really overlook the fact that along their fierce anti-Zionist position, there is a very, very harsh critique of Arab nationalism at the time. And now let me just share the screen if I can, and I'm just going to read the primary source, if you don't mind, and conclude my presentation here, which is, of course, so is it there? Wait, share. Right, do you see it? Thank you. So this
Yes.
is translation from Arabic from a text that is called Zionism, the Enemy of Arabs and Jews. That's the title of the text. And I'm going to read just a few paragraphs that relate to Arab nationalism in the text, right? So now, for example, one piece. They write, anti-Zionist Marxist Jews in Baghdad, 1946. If we were to warn against Zionist manipulation of the principles of the Jewish religion, the use of religion by Zionists, we would also warning the sons of our Iraqi people against religious abuse by Iraqi elements known for their fascist tendencies in our country, as well as against the spread of dissonance and discord. Remember, the people that write here are the most radical anti-Zionists that probably existed in the Middle East. I'm going to the next citation, again, straight from the primary call. They write, the same things that happened in Tsarist Russia, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan took place in Britain, with colonialists encouraging Oswald Mosley's fascist movement. The Brits in the audience know who is Oswald Mosley, the chief fascist British. And then they write, and other fascist movements in colonized or quasi-colonized country by supplying and supporting them with money and gold, as is happening nowadays in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So what I'm trying to say here, anti-Zionist Jews in 1946, Iraq or Baghdad, that are chiefly writing a text against European Zionism in Palestine, always include inside the argument a harsh criticism of the ultra-nationalist and fascist tendencies that they also experiencing being minority members of the Marxist movement in Iraq. Let me just conclude with two citations of the final citation. Again, it's only a part. So they write, 1946 Baghdad, yes, in the United States, Henry Ford, the owner of the Ford Motor Company, held by Father Charles Coughlin. This is quite a racist radio broadcaster. Never mind who the guy is. Under the cover of piety, right? The same role that fundamentalists perform today in the name of religion in Arab countries was awarded a decoration by Hitler in 1967 in recognition of Ford's help to Hitler's anti-Semitic effort. You can see here that they have no hesitation to say that that ultra-nationalist fascism does exist also around them in Iraq, and the issue is that Arab anti-Zionism need to correct this state of affairs. And final paragraph, because I don't have time, let's read the final paragraph. As for other countries subject to British influence, and remind you that Palestine and Iraq is subject to British influence during the time that it is written, 1946, all the organizations that previously sold themselves to German fascists have resurfaced. So the anti-Zionist position of Jews in 1946 Iraq is that fascist organizations that collaborated with Germany are already again present on the ground, right? And they say they resurfaced with colonial powers now supplying them with money and directing them according to their colonial wishes. They have thus resumed their acts of sabotage. And then conclusion, 1946, anti-Zionist Jews in relation to Arab nationalism, they say riots that erupted in connection with Jews in Egypt, in Tripoli provide further evidence of criminal actions and underground plots by colonial hired agents against Jews and against Arab liberation movements alike. So what I'm suggesting, and that's the last word, Arabized Jews in the mid-1940s, Baghdad, anti-Zionist Arab Jews, had a serious correction to introduce to Arab nationalism if the aim is to, so to speak, liberate Palestine and introduce democratic features into the region, right? And at the end of the affairs, you need to remember that most of these Jews were quite hated by the people around them. Ultra-nationalists in any place don't like that much Marxists, whether they are Jews or non-Jews, and ultimately their fate was not better than the fate of Zionist Iraqi Jews during the time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Chico. I think that was brilliant and interesting, and there's a lot to discuss. And I have many questions that I'm gonna raise later. But let's go now to Gabriel for another lecture, and then we're gonna open everything to the discussion. Keep on writing your question in the chat. Okay. Yes. Gabriel.
Hi. So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. And you can see the screen? Yeah. Okay, so good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And first of all, thanks to the organizer of this lecture series, Professor Yuval Ivry and Professor Angie Cohen. And as part of this lecture series on Sephardi Jews on the global left, I would like to present a comparative analysis of two major French-speaking anti-colonial thinkers, Albert Memmi and Frantz Fanon. And before we begin, I should mention that two important works about these great thinkers have recently been published. First, an intellectual biography of Fanon by Adam Schatz, and a critical edition of Memmi's portraits by Guy Dugas in French. So those interested in delving deeper into their thoughts will find, I'm sure, these works particularly valuable. Now let's turn to Memmi and Fanon. These two intellectuals developed different approaches to the Jewish question, particularly regarding the place of Jews within the colonized world, what was then called the Third World, and what we now refer to as the Global South. And through their works, I want to demonstrate that the current divide we see between two seemingly irreconcilable lefts, especially concerning the Jewish question or attitudes towards Zionism and even the very definition of modern anti-Semitism, actually has its roots in the twilight of the colonial era. And these profound divergences were already present in the writings of these two great thinkers. And despite both being firmly anchored on the left, they developed opposing visions of Jewish identity and the Jewish condition. And to understand how these divergent positions emerged, we must first remember the central place that Jews occupied in leftist thought in France in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Whether in Sartre, Césaire, or Fanon, Jews became the very symbol of otherness in the West. And it was in relation to them and through their experience that these thinkers articulated their ideas about other forms of otherness and domination, particularly colonial domination. And this centrality of the Jewish figure appears particularly striking in Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, first published in 1952, where the Jewish condition is prominently featured. Fanon notably quotes Aimé Césaire twice, and though it departs from Césaire's perspective. And the first quote is from Césaire's political speeches in 1945. You can see it on your screen. When I turn on my radio and hear that Black people are being lynched in America, I say, we've been lied to. Hitler is not dead. When I turn on my radio and learn that Jews are being insulted, despised, subjected to pogroms, I say, we've been lied to. Hitler is not dead. When I turn on my radio one last time and learn that in Africa, forced labor has been instituted and legalized, I say that truly we've been lied to. Hitler is not dead. And we also have this second quote, equally revealing on your screen. Second, okay. When you hear people speaking ill of Jews, pay attention. They are talking about you. And in these quotes, Césaire draws the parallel between anti-Semitism and racial and colonial violence. While Fanon builds on Césaire's parallel, he also becomes interested in what he sees as the fundamental distinction between the Jewish condition and the Black condition. So let's read what Fanon writes about this. Again, it is on your screen. However, the Jew can be ignored in his Jewishness. He is not entirely what he is. There is hope, there is waiting. His acts and behavior are the final determinants. He is a white man, and apart from some rather debatable characteristics, he can sometimes go unnoticed. The Jew is disliked from the moment he is detected. But with me, everything takes on a new face. No chance is permitted me. I am over-determined from the outside. I am not the slave of the idea that others have of me, but of my appearance. And I think that this text reveals two fundamental theoretical positions. The first concerns this essential difference between Jews and Black people. According to Fanon, Jews can conceal their Jewishness. They can, for a moment, escape the anti-Semitic gaze and be seen in their humanity as long as their identity remains invisible. And Black people, on the other hand, are immediately identified with no possible escape, making them, in Fanon's words, slaves to their appearance. And in this way, Fanon departs from Césaire by refusing to equate the Black condition with the Jewish one. And this analysis of the Jewish condition clearly echoes Sartre's thoughts. We find first and foremost the idea that the Jews is defined by how anti-Semites perceive them. In the same text, Fanon explicitly quotes Sartre. The Jews, or it is a quotation from Sartre, the Jews is a man whom other men consider Jewish. That's the simple truth from which we must begin. It is the anti-Semite who creates the Jew. End of the quote. But what immediately striking is that Fanon rejects Sartre's universalist reading when it comes to Black people. As Adam Schatz has noted, and I quote from him, Fanon suggested that Sartre's entire framework for understanding alienation reveals itself to be false when applied to Black consciousness. In other words, Fanon adhered to the Sartrean line regarding Jews, resulting in a critique of all forms of Jewish ethnic particularism while rejecting it when it came to Black people. But perhaps the most significant claim in Fanon's analysis, and one that demands our careful attention, is this categorization of Jews as white. And we need to pause here and ask ourselves, what exactly do we mean by whiteness in this context? We can certainly understand Fanon's observation about European Jews' ability to blend into this whiteness, to escape the anti-Semitic gaze. But his analysis becomes far more problematic when extended to North African Jews. This is where we begin to see the limitations of applying a European-centered understanding of Jewishness to the colonial context of North Africa. And here's what Fanon writes about colonial dynamics in Algeria. So it is on your screen. The Algerian Frenchman doesn't like the Jew, who doesn't like the Arab, who doesn't like the black man. To the Arab, they say, if you're poor, it's because the Jew has cheated you, has taken everything from you. To the Jew, they say, you're not on the same level as the Arabs because you're actually white, and you have Bergson and Einstein. To the black man, they say, you're the best soldiers in the French Empire. The Arabs think they are superior to you, but they are wrong. And this analysis has profound implications. Not only does it erase Jewish specificity, Jews, as in Sartre's work, having only a negative identity defined by non-Jews' perception, but more significantly in the colonial context, this assignment of whiteness places Jews de facto on the side of the colonizers. And this vision of Jews as part of the wild colonial society in North Africa finds its most extreme expression in A Dying Colonialism, a book about the Algerian struggle for independence published in 1959. And there, Fanon makes a politically loaded choice. He analyzes Algerian Jewish society in a chapter titled The European Minority in Algeria. So he effectively denatived them. And one might be tempted to minimize the significance of this choice by assuming that Fanon was simply referring to Algerian Jews' legal status as French citizens. But this interpretation doesn't hold up. Fanon himself always insisted on race, not citizenship, as the determining factor in the category of colonizers. So we need to understand the logic at work here. For Fanon, who follows Sartre on this point, there is no such a thing a Jewish race, nor a Jewish people. But what's even more striking is that he extends his conception of European Jews to Algerian Jews. And in Fanon's logic, Algerian Jews are separated from the Maghreb and are like any other Jews, and therefore they are actually white. And this position becomes even clearer in his analysis of Algerian Jews' attitude toward the independence struggle in Algeria. Fanon notes that a minority clearly opposes it for economics reasons, while the majority adopts a wait-and-see position. And he adds this revealing comment. One second. Okay, you can see it on your screen too. Alongside the two major categories of Jewish merchants and civil servants, there is the large floating mass, highly Arabized, with only a mediocre knowledge of French, considering themselves through tradition and sometimes through dress as authentic natives. And Fanon's use of quotation marks around natives or indigènes in French is telling. Later in the book, Fanon suggests that Jewish claims to belonging would only be validated through active participation in the independence struggle, a condition not imposed on other native populations, even those with French citizenship. And spoiler, as Le Foll-Luciani's work shows, even Jews who actively supported independence and even fought for it were ultimately denied Algerian citizenship and forced to leave. while Fanon's intention was to encourage Jews to engage more actively in the liberation struggle, his words express, I think, the very reasons for their own ambivalence. The majority did consider itself as an ethnic group, and how can a minority group confidently commit to a future when one's very belonging to the land is questioned? How can one embrace a national project when asked to prove one's rights to belong to the emerging nation? And the crucial question that Fanon doesn't ask is obvious. Was equal citizenship between Muslims and Jews even conceivable in post-colonial Algeria? And I believe that this approach has spawned an even more radical interpretation, one that's gained considerable traction today. The neo-Fanonian narrative considers that Zionism's sole purpose was to enable Jews to assimilate into Western whiteness, and by embracing it, Sephardi Jews or North African Jews supposedly betrayed their Arab brothers, who, according to this narrative, had never shown anti-Semitism prior the colonial period. And I think it is a common narrative today among a lot of decolonial writers, as for example, Hoya Boutelja in France. She is very explicit about it. And this serves to justify the erasure of Jewish history from these countries, just as the alleged lack of Jewish support for independence in Algeria becomes pretext for their erasure. So let's now turn to Albert Memmi, who offers us a different perspective.
Just to say, Gabriel, that you have another 5 minutes.
Okay. 7. Okay. Memmi was a Jew of Tunisian origin, and he established himself as one of the first French-speaking anti-colonial thinkers, particularly with the publication of the Colonizer on the Colonized in 1957. But alongside his reflection on the colonial condition, he developed a deep analysis of the Jewish condition, which he describes in strikingly similar terms. So let me share what he wrote about this. In short, I believe there exists a Jewish condition. I mean, a specific Jewish condition. And this condition makes the Jews a minority being, different, separated from himself and separated from others in his culture, his history, in his past, and in his daily life. And what have I done here but sketch the main features of a figure of oppression? Yes, as a Jew, I am above all an oppressed person, and the Jewish condition is essentially a condition of oppression. I have now verified this often. From this perspective, my figure bears a striking resemblance to many other oppressed people, precisely. So, in fact, we can say that Memmi actually aligns with Fanon's critique of Sartre's universalism. Both thinkers view self-affirmation as a necessary step in the liberation of any oppressed group, even if it is not the ultimate goal. But unlike Fanon, Memmi believed this principle extended to Jews as well, precisely because Jews possess their own positive identity, one that exists independently of anti-Semites. And what's particularly interesting about Memmi's approach is that he identifies with other oppressed peoples, especially the colonized, precisely as a Jew, while being aware that his Jewishness separates between them. And he sees this condition of oppression both in the emancipated Jews in France and in the one living in the Jewish quarter of Tunis. His own experience embodies this intersection of oppressions. He is a subject colonized by France, and a Jew in a society where Islam is hegemonic, and his own Jewishness in the margins. And
Yep.
that we arrive here at a
No, that's okay. Okay.
I think that we arrive here at a fascinating element of Memmi's thought. It's precisely because he believes in people's positive identities that he understands why post-colonial North African states choose to define themselves as Arab and Muslim at the expense of their Jewish populations. But it's exactly for these same reasons that he believes the Jews of the Maghreb cannot truly remain there. And in a significant text of 1967, Memmi outlines three possible places for North African Jews facing oppression, choosing the West. So he sees this as stemming from the loss of faith in North Africa's future, merely exchanging one set of problems for another. The second is remaining in the Maghreb to fight for full integration, hoping without guarantee that laws will eventually accommodate non-Muslims. And the third, which he calls the return to self, involves embracing Jewish identity as primary, and it leads to Zionism because Jewish identity becomes also political identity. And we have to add that Memmi presents none of these options as ideal, acknowledging each one's inherent limitations. And this leads us to Memmi's distinctive conception of Zionism, which he views from a radically non-Western perspective. His logic is straightforward. Jews are a Middle Eastern minority, and at a time when other peoples of the region are achieving national independence through what he terms self-rehabilitation, they have a legitimate right to make similar claims to a territory proportional to their presence in the region and with which they maintain significant cultural ties. And this perspective became particularly clear in his famous conversation with Colonel Gaddafi. And when the Libyan leaders urged Mizrahi Jews to leave Palestine and return home, a call that, for Memmi, fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of Jewish presence in Israel-Palestine and the reasons for their departure from Arab countries. And I think that it is also one of the particularly interesting aspects of this Zionist thought. It is that it's fundamentally Sephardi-centered. For Memmi, European and Eastern Jews share the same conditions, the same past, the same history, and this is why he categorically rejects the idea that Zionism could be a colonial movement, because there is no intrusion of a group foreign to the Middle East. But it is also important to add that Memmi was not blind to Palestinian oppression. On the contrary, Memmi was among the few French Jewish intellectuals to oppose it from the 1960s onward, particularly after the Six-Day War. But for Memmi, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not exceptional, but rather similar to many other ethnic conflicts in the region. And more significantly, in his final work, Portrait of a Decolonized, published in 2004, he interweaves his critique of Israel with a broader criticism of post-colonial states, arguing that they all suffer from similar afflictions, largely stemming from their conditions as formerly oppressed peoples and the shortcomings of their self-rehabilitation process. So he sees the growing corruption and oppression of minorities in Israel as comparable to similar phenomena in Egypt or Algeria, all manifestations of the same post-colonial or post-oppressed predicament. And in conclusion, I want to emphasize that my goal in this comparative analysis of Fanon and Memmi was not to arbitrate between their position. What interested me was showing how their divergent approaches, which are rooted in the very definition of Jewish identity and extend into their analysis of North African Jew situation, progressively carved a deep fault line within anti-colonial leftist thought itself. And today we can only observe the extent of the misunderstanding that separates these two streams of the left, engaged in endless debates over contemporary issues. And my aim was to invite you to return to the sources, to examine the theoretical roots, often implicit, of this division, because it's perhaps by better understanding the genealogy of our disagreements that we can hope to understand each other, even if we can't agree. And thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating and really, really thought-provoking. Yuval, should we start should we open the floor for questions? Do you want to start with your own questions?
Yeah, I think that there is first of all, many questions on the chat that it speaks volume on the interest of these topics. For me, I just will say that for me, it was really interesting to see, first of all, the different moments that Moshe Behar presented, and to capture, and that's one of probably the questions that I would be interested to hear more from Moshe, because I know that he's more than 20 years, even more than that, year of research and activism is on how can we tell the history of Mizrahi left, if it's these moments, what they mean, these different moments that you are mentioning, and the connection between, in each moment, your emphasis that every left it needs to be in a conversation with the global, or transnational kind of struggle of indigeneity or anti-colonial or anti-imperial causes, what it means and how it means about when we're talking it from here. And with Gabriel, I think that is super interesting, the conversation between Fanon and Memmi. Memmi himself is writing about Fanon in real time and the connection between the two. But for me, it was interesting, I agree that his letter to Gaddafi is super interesting, and how he's framing it and there he's framing in two moments that you didn't mention. First is the Palestinian question, meaning, the Mizrahi Jews are also refugees, something that will start from the 1970s onwards to be a big trend in some circles of, trying to portray the Mizrahi Jews or the Arabized Jews or the Arab Jews as refugees. And the second thing that will come, I think, also as a conflict and his tension in his position, is when the Black Panthers will come to Paris and present their pose in leftist circles in Paris, and he will be against them. So also internal colonialism. But it means that Mizrahi Jews also are suffering of colonialism. It's another question. So I'm interested to hear from both of you about that kind of, and also Moshe, something that I missed in your talk is a bit more, if you can tell some biography about the people, about Zilcha that you mentioned. It's also is mentioned in the book that you edited in the anthology, but if you can say something also about the figures that you are, okay. But do you want to? Yeah, we can start with that and then end you. Do another.
So I'm speaking to you now about your trying to address your questions, Yuval.
Yes, let's start with that, and then we'll Ro'i Shukrun that is with us will help us reads the question that we already have in the chat, and maybe other question that will rise.
Right. So you know better than me that Kastel was a Jew from El Halil, from a Hebronite Jew, native Jew from the city of Hebron, native speaker of Arabic, the quintessential Palestinian Jew, if they existed, right? And this vista, in a way, I think, enabled him to see a little bit more than, let's say, people that straightforwardly belong to either European Zionist Jews, right, or Palestinian Arabs. It was a bit of a in between. In the case of Yusuf Harun Zilka, that is the chief author of the it's 9,000 word essay, Zionism, the enemy of Jews and Arabs. Remember, the text is about Zionism, yeah? Not about Arab nationalism. 90% of the text is a critique of European Zionism that he but, right? In the same time, he of course, also, why is he an anti-Zionist? Because he believes that his own civil society can be reformed from within. He doesn't have any intention to go away and find solution outside. So he is, of course, simultaneously part and parcel of the communist left, so to speak, trying to transform Iraqi civil society and the Iraqi state. It's a monarchy, undemocratic monarchy under Hashemite control at the time that he writes. And the interesting about Yusuf, because they were persecuted, it didn't help them to be anti-Zionist. They were still persecuted because of their anti-establishment and a leftist position. So the ultra-nationalists of the play, the Istiklal, did go after them. Some of them were, of course, executed. And the thing is that in the case of him, the interesting thing about him that he ended up in Israel in 1951. And since the moment, because his entire life project was so shattered, right, that he, from this point onward, refused to give any interview to any researcher, and he just continued to live as a Jew in exile in Israel, right, an exile Arab Jew in Israel, refused to give interviews to, for example, Reuven Snir, that tried to completely disappeared because he was completely disillusioned by the development of Iraqi nationalism in his case and Zionism, and that's a very tragic story. So that's the case of him. And the other people in the third episode of the 1950s, these are people that we all know. Shimon Balas, Sami Michael, that just passed away 6 months ago at the age of 98, was born in 1926. Shimon Balas was born in 1930. So this is these are the Iraqi Jews mostly, but although there were a few others that David Tzemach, who were native speakers of Arabic, trying to advance leftist politics inside the Eurocentric state of Israel. That's the situation.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Val, for your question, and I think that you pointed out one of the limitation of Memmi's thought on Zionism, and in general, I think that he views Zionism in a binary way. Either Jews are a people in a liberation process, and in which case it's not a colonial movement, or Jews are European individuals who came to settle in the Middle East, making it a colonial movement. But even if we share Memmi's vision of Jews as constituting ethnic group or a people, and even if we agree with the principle of Jewish self-determination over a part of mandatory Palestine, we can still question colonial practices, for example. And we see Memmi's difficulty in conceiving the possibility of a dual identity, for example, being both Zionist and Jew and Western. In his treatment of Sephardic discrimination in Israel, and you already mentioned it, but Memmi was obviously critical of this discrimination. But I think it was in 1975, at a congress in Paris that brought together oppressed peoples from around the world, Memmi openly opposed the Israeli Black Panthers, who had denounced Israeli state racism. And Memmi claimed that we couldn't talk about racism in this case because all the groups involved were Jewish. But I think that in other words, the fact that Jews are a people doesn't exclude the possibility that they could adopt European colonial practices, for example. And there's no doubt that the Zionist movement developed around colonial semantics, quite different from Memmi's semantics of self-rehabilitation. And it seems clear to me that we can observe colonial practices such as the desire for total or partial ethnic cleaning, the erasure of history on the land dispossession. And what I'm saying is, I believe we can share Memmi's vision of Zionism while still criticizing the movement's colonialist aspects. And today you could say that continuing Memmi's thinking might mean thinking about how to decolonize Zionism.
Thank you. I just want to make a very short comment slash maybe question. I don't know, because I want to open, there's a ton of questions on the chat. I don't think we're going to be able to cover them all, not even half, but after listening to the both of you, I was thinking about whether the very definition of Jewish peoplehood is compatible, or whether the very definition of Jewish peoplehood introduces, to the very least, an ambiguity and an ambivalence in the place of the Jews in leftist movements, and in the place of the Jews in both the Middle East, in the context of Arab nationalism, and also in the north of Africa. I was and I don't think there's a way to solve this. The definition of Jewish peoplehood doesn't necessarily exclude different languages, different cultures, different belongings. Not necessarily, but in fact, as we've seen in Israel, Jews can indeed have all these different origins, and can indeed not only adopt colonial practices, they can oppress each other, because you can have different groups within one peoplehood. So I was just, I guess this is just I thought I'm sharing with the both of you, and because at the end of the day, it does sound like the very definition of Jewish peoplehood seems to be incompatible with the presence of Jews with the natural presence of Jews, or an ambiguous presence of Jews within these movements. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, Moshe.
Right. Let me try to test your question vis-a-vis the three groups of indigenous Middle Eastern, let's call them Jews, and see what they say about it.
Okay.
My reading, and Yuval be my guest to. So, for example, I think that the Palestinian Jews, post-Ottoman Palestinian Jews, the ones that were in between 1917 and 1922, interestingly enough, they definitely thought that Jews worldwide comprise a people.
Mm-hmm.
There is such thing that is called the people of Israel. They did believe it, that there is a collective identity. Exactly as when you go to church, you can hear the phrase, the people of Israel, also in churches in the 16th century. That's not something new. Also in Arabic, Banu Israel, you will hear the notions. So that's the one thing. But they did not think that this collectivity deserves or should have a state that is Jewish. So they said the collectivity can realize its collective interest in a state, right? In a sub-state configuration. That's what binationalism is, for example, right? So the state is not Jewish, it's binational, and you don't get you don't have a Jewish state or a nation state. So this is the first group. Let's go to the last group. It's a different answer. I believe that the Iraqi Jews that were inside Israel did believe that there exists a Hebrew-speaking Jewish collectivity, right? They didn't think that there's a Jewish nation.
Okay.
So American Jews or Jews in Spain or Jews in London don't have rights in Palestine, Israel. They're citizens of their own country, and they thought that the law of return should be annulled because it's discriminatory vis-a-vis non-Jews inside the state of Israel. So they say, yes, collective rights should be awarded to Hebrew-speaking Jews that live between the river and the sea. Now let's go to the third group, the anti-Zionists of the 1945. They certainly did not think that there exists a Jewish nation, for sure not. They didn't. Also, when they speak about this, that's why they're different. When communist Jews in Iraq speak about collective rights, right? They speak about the collective rights of the working class, not of Jews or Muslims or Shiite Muslims or Ismaili Muslims or whatever, right? So the issue here, most Marxists, let's say until I would say 1939, did not think that there's such thing that is called a Jewish nation, because the Jews worldwide do not fulfill the requirements that are needed in order to form a national collective, a joint language, joint territory, blah, 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 especially in Marxist reasoning of what a nation is, right? So Jews in this case should be awarded individual rights as members of the Iraqi national body, right? And collective rights are not given to anyone, right? Because it's a secular state that is supposed to be, a socialist or a Marxist state that awards individual rights to everybody, women, of course, too, and take care of the collective rights of everybody in a kind of utopist, Marxist or communist setting. So you can see three different Jews in the Middle East suggest different answers to the question you raised.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Angie, for your question, your remark. I think the debate between Fanon and Memmi really centers on this question of whether there is a Jewish peoplehood, there is a positive Jewish identity, and whether Jews exist beyond just being defined by anti-Semites. And Memmi argues for the possibility of a positive Jewish identity, and for Fanon, the anti-Semite creates the Jews, so there is no real Jewish peoplehood. And I think that to a large extent, this debate between Memmi and Fanon is the actual debate between a larger part of many left-wing Jews and non-Jewish lefts. And because broadly speaking, of course, it is a generalization, but most Jews consider that Jewishness exists, and that he has positive content, and that Jews are an ethnic group or an ethno-religion, as you want. And conversely, most non-Jewish left-wing thinkers and activists consider Judaism solely as a religion. And of course, if it is the base of the debate, so the conclusion will be very different on a large panel of issues, including modern anti-Semitism and the definition of anti-Semitism today.
Well, thank you. This would be like a huge, we could spend hours here, days, weeks, but fortunately we can't. So let's move on to the chat, Roy.
Okay, so for brevity, I'm going to collapse some of these questions, and some of them I feel have been answered, so I'm going to, yes. Okay, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then give everyone time to answer. So first of all, Moshe, Matan Board wants you to clarify, did the communist Iraqis that you speak of in the 1950s acknowledge the Palestinian right of return? And did they see Palestinian refugees outside of Palestine as part of the Palestinian national collective that they were thinking of? Gabriel, actually, this can be maybe I have a few questions that could be for both of you with this. Were Fanon and Memmi, and then this also from Moshe, with the people that you're talking about, were they aware in their writing about Amazigh, people in Morocco and in other places, and in Algeria and Tunisia, other places in North Africa, and how did this affect their understanding of either being Arabized or being or individual and collective rights in the places that they were, why don't we start with those questions?
Yeah, if you can do like a short comments, and we're gonna do another collect that will be able to do another collection of questions that will be great. Yes, Moshe.
Yeah, so I try to be brief to have some more questions for Matan. The position of these Jews, exactly as the position of the journal within which they published, Al Jadid, right, was very simple. There is a necessity to fulfill United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194. Very simple. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194 was voted in December of 1948, right, by the General Assembly. And 5 months later, this admission of the State of Israel into the United Nations rested on accepting all the resolution, because the State of Israel was not a member of the United Nations when 181 and 194 passed, of course, right? So the condition, if you read the admission of the State of Israel into the United Nations, is supposed to be predicated upon the fulfillment of the United Nations Resolution 181 and 194. Because the Soviet Union supported 181, and I'm going to say something here that I am willing to bet $1,000 that nobody knows what I'm going to say now. I wish I have no problem. So the Soviet Union and the United States voted for partitioning in Palestine. A year later, there was a vote in 194. What was the vote of the United States in relation to 194? You don't know, so don't even try. The vote of the United States would support 194, whereas the Soviet Union opposed 194, interestingly enough. And also the 6 Arab states also voted against 194 at the time, by the way, separate issue. When we move into the early 1950s, even those who opposed 194 before, Arabs, yeah, said, no, we need to adopt it. If you go to the page of the boycott, divestment, and sanction, 194 is on the front page. So this is a consensus, and the Jews that I mentioned did say that the resolution needs to be addressed, right? How exactly and what, it's not for them to decide. There's supposed to be a process, but Article 11 of the resolution speaks about the right to return compensation and the other things.
So thank you for the questions. I want to begin with Fanon, and I don't think Fanon had any systematic thoughts about Jews, and even less about North African Jews specifically. But reading between the lines, you can get a sense of how he saw them. And so I already mentioned it. He explicitly aligns with Sartre's view of Jews. And then in Algeria, he doesn't really question it much. He just sees Jews as French people who happen to have some connection to local culture, even though some of them saw themselves as indigenous. But for him, it's pretty clear he primarily sees them as white French people. And so at most, they could be potential, allies to the Arab population, but not really part of the indigenous community themselves. And obviously, this is something we have to criticize because it just doesn't hold up. Either Jews are a distinct people or they are Arabs who practice Judaism in North Africa, Arab or Amazigh, but they are part of these, indigenous populations. But there is no way you can lump them. Lump them in with European colonizers who forced French culture on them against their will, causing all sorts of internal conflicts and struggles. And concerning Memmi and the Arabized Jews, I think that the interesting thing with Memmi is that he uses and rejects the term of Arab Jews. And he uses like when we say European Jews. For him, the adjective Arab simply describes where these Jews lived and the aspects of their culture, but it doesn't define their core identity. So he considered the Jews as a native people of the Middle East, but saw them as a distinctive people, not as a part of an Arab nation, even if they were part of the Arab culture. So this is for Memmi.
Okay. So now for Moshe again, we have a few questions about how you use Zionism. You said before the story of Zionism ends when you accept, Castel, you said you don't consider Castel a Zionist because it was Castel, right, in the 1919, because the story of Zionism ends when you accept another group has collective rights in Palestine, I think you said. Can you speak more about that? I can say, at least in the interwar period, a lot of historians talk about Zionism amongst Europeanized North African Jews as a very flexible kind of Zionism. Can you expand on this a little bit? For Gabriel, I invite Amina Bukail, who raised her hand in the chat earlier, to ask a question for Gabriel.
Why don't start with Amina?
Yes, I inviting now Amina to unmute and to ask her question.
Okay, good evening. Thank you so much for your very interesting approach. Hi, Gabriel. I have a question for you because Frantz Fanon is a very important figure here in Algeria, and just recently we are recognized this figure. Let me ask you about the human insight of Frantz Fanon with the question of Jews, especially of Jews of Algeria. We know that there is many Jews who choose the Algerian revolution to be part of this revolution. Maybe many of them there are communists, and it's no coincidence that, for example, Alice Sharqi, who is a friend very close to Frantz Fanon, and she wrote beautiful and important bibliography about Frantz Fanon, and she is Jewish from Algeroise Jewish family from Algiers. So we cannot say that Frantz Fanon was indifferent to to this question of Jews of Algeria, because if you read this bibliography about Alice Sharqi or other Henry Allaq or other Jewish Algerian resistance in this period, we can maybe highlight other dimension. What do you think?
You need to unmute. Gabriel.
Okay, so you want me to answer first, because I think Moshe begins something. No. Thank you, Amina, for your question. You know, I totally agree with you. I think it is an important remark. Fanon was in contact with a lot of Jews in Algeria, but I think that, like Sartre, Fanon was surrounded by highly assimilated Jews who wanted to embrace French identity at any cost. And I think that the source of his reading of Jewishness, which obviously contradicts how more traditional Jews see themselves, is that he didn't try to speak with what he called the Arabized Jews, the mass, this floating mass of Arabized Jews. But so I think that considering the Jewish question on Fanon, even if he was a great thinker, he showed some intellectual laziness when he completely decontextualizing the situation of Algerian Jews and their history, seeing them first and foremost as French, when just a few years earlier they had lost their citizenship simply for being Jewish during the Vichy period. But of course, I don't think that it is a part of a systemic way of thinking. The Jewish question for Fanon was only, the beginning of the conversation, not on the Jews, but on the colonized people, on the people victims of racism.
Moshe?
Yes, so Zionism is a concept, right? What does it mean? It means that different individuals, different scholars, different political activists are going to define it differently, right? So the only thing I can say, I can explain what I understand as Zionism. Zionism, in my understanding, is a European question to a European problem. There was a problem, a so-called Jewish question of anti-Semitic racism in Europe, and Zionism was one of the movements alongside Bund and Marxism that tried to address the issue, right? And Zionism means the Jews need to, sorry, the colloquial language, schlep themselves from Eastern Europe to Ottoman Palestine. And if we read the book of Theodor Herzl, 1896, Judenstaat, for most Zionists, most, not all, the meaning was to try and engage in a process of state formation, build a university, Hebrew University 1925, mail, armed forces, bureaucracy, create state, right? And the state's supposed to be a Jewish state, exactly as the self-proclaimed Jewish state of Israel defines itself today, right? My proposition is that any individual, especially before 1948, that does not subscribe to the notion of establishing a separatist Jewish state is not a Zionist. That's my, if you want to call them non-Zionists, someone I saw, it doesn't matter. They are not Zionists in the sense that they do not believe that a Jewish state will address the questions that Jews face either globally or also in Palestine. So when, for example, Brit Shalom in 1925, after our guys, everybody knows about Brit Shalom, of course, because they are German professors and everybody knows about them, but about Castell and Chaim Ben Kiki and many others that wrote about similar ideas about 10 years before them, nobody knows. So these two groups, at the moment that they speak about a shared, equally shared space, right? This is not Zionism, because Zionism is not about shared space. It's not about symmetry. It's not about equality between groups. It's not about it. So it's about something else. And so that's why my reading is that he is proposing, at least in 1921, a non-Zionist thesis to try and address the issue of collective rights to Jews. They can be achieved, but it doesn't mean that an independent Jewish state is there. I sit right now in Manchester. If I drive 1 hour from here, I go to Wales. So Wales, you're going to run into signs in Wales. You're going to have a different language. The trains are going to speak in Welsh. I mean, but it's not a state. It's not a state. It's a region that has enjoyed some rights to safeguard the collective rights of individuals who self-define themselves as members of the Welsh group or people or whatever. That's, I think, what they had in mind in the early 1920s as an alternative to the hegemonic mainstream European Zionism led by Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion.
Okay. Do we have time for another question, or are we reaching the end?
It's we've already, yeah, we try to be strict about the hour and a half. What do you say, Yuval? Wait, you're muted.
Yeah, I think that we should, yeah, and two, because if not, it will go. But even though I think it's what we're gonna do is we try to collect all the questions from the chat and send to you, Moshe, and to you, Gabriel.